Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, we have a representative form of government. We vote for the people who are going to represent us. But what if it's actually rigged before we can even cast a ballot? We're going to unpack that today with Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent. I'm just glad that people vote with their phones and choose to listen to or watch this podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I think it's going to be really fun. I think we're going to talk about and combine two different election-related topics in a way that maybe no one else has thus far. Maybe there's a reason why they haven't done it. Maybe they shouldn't be combined, Peter Schweizer, but maybe they should.
I think they should, because there's been a lot of debate, of course, about voting, about ballots, about ballot access from the left, about voter fraud from the right, of what actually happens in the ballot box. But we're going to step back before that and look at how it's decided how congressional districts are drawn, how states get how many congressional seats. And it's very interesting. And this is different than gerrymandering, which a lot of people are familiar with. This goes back from the founding of the United States. Congressional districts, they're drawn by politicians to gain a certain advantage. We're talking about something actually deeper here, about how the census has been manipulated to benefit Democrats primarily, and how they have used civil rights laws and other parts of American legal history to manipulate how congressional districts are drawn to the detriment of certain political candidates.
No, and the term gaslighting gets used a lot.
Yeah.
But it's really fascinating if you consider, we clearly have an unfortunate history of racial suppression in this country. That is without dispute.
Absolutely.
What is in dispute, it's literally being disputed at the Supreme Court. It was last week. It's set to be decided sometime soon, is how relevant is our history of racial suppression and oppression to how we draw up congressional districts today.
Right.
And it's really fascinating because the two African-American justices could not be on further divide on this topic. Clarence Thomas is like, look, this is ridiculous. We could have gotten away with this a long time ago.
Right. And
Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest member of the Supreme Court, and by the way, the most vocal. If you look at she's what they call a high volume shooter in terms of the amount of the time she spends talking, which is also in direct opposition to Clarence Thomas. But she made a very interesting comparison talking about black voters. So listen to what she had to say. This is last week at the Supreme Court.
I guess I'm thinking of the fact that remedial action absent discriminatory intent is really not a new idea in the civil rights laws. And my kind of paradigmatic example of this is something like the ADA. Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act against the backdrop of a world that was generally not accessible to people with disabilities. And so it was discriminatory in effect because these folks were not able to access these buildings. And it didn't matter whether the person who built the building or the person who owned the building intended for them to be exclusionary. That's irrelevant. Congress said the facilities have to be made equally open to people with disabilities if readily possible. I guess I don't understand why that's not what's happening here. The idea in Section 2 is that we are responding to current day manifestations of past and present decisions that disadvantage minorities and make it so that they don't have equal access to the voting system, right? They're disabled. In fact, we use the word disable in Milligan. We say that's a way in which you see that these processes are not equally open.
So she's literally saying that black voters are disabled. She's drawing that comparison.
She is in fact drawing that comparison.
And so this case, let's just to be clear, is about, it's being challenged in the Supreme Court, the notion that states can create black majority or Hispanic majority or some minority advantaged district that is designed to go to a specific ethnic group. And that is being challenged as unconstitutional. And look, I think, as you talked about, certainly in our history, we had problems 100 years ago. We had problems 75 years ago. I don't think we really have the same problems today in terms of any kind of, systemic a problem that's taking place. But this practice of minority majority districts benefits one political party, correct?
I think there's no doubt. And it's interesting because, just the pendulum can swing back and forth. Our whole history of like how, from Reconstruction and then like what that did to African-American representation in Congress and the rights people had. But the point is that ended after a decade, and then it swung back very much the other way. And the stats, are very real about that. And there have been practices that states have used to oppress votes. You were, I think, surprised to learn that multi-member districts were a thing even up until the 60s, which is to say, so if you're a minority group, you could have 49%, but the majority could vote for every representative of a certain state in Congress. So, and they said, okay, in 1967, they did away with that. So that's why we have individual districts to ensure better representation. And the stats have shown a significant increase since that time. And we have a chart here. Even just in this century, there used to be, I think, 26 members of Congress that were a minority at the beginning of the century, and it's now well into like the 70s. And so, I mean, it's tripled in the last 20 plus years.
So the question is how many of those are in minority majority districts? In other words, districts were carved out specifically for them. We had Congressman Wesley Hunt on the show. He specifically explained to us, I'm not in a minority district. This is a majority white district. How many would you say of those 70 are probably, are in Congress because a district was set up explicitly for their ethnic group?
I mean, no pun intended, but a minority.
Yeah, so it benefits some, and
you set me up so well.
And I think if you look at a lot of the, let's say, usual voices, certain districts in California come to mind, certain different districts in Texas come to mind. These tend to be particularly outspoken members of Congress, very left-wing members of Congress. They come from these districts. Now, to go back to what the Supreme Court Justice said, there's no evidence that people are prevented from voting in any of these districts. This is not like after Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, when black voters started voting, they voted Republican, and then the Democrats in the South said we can't have that, so they actually restricted and prevented people from voting. People can vote now. So what is the argument that she's making using the analogy that black voters are handicapped?
Right. Well, I think so. For them to basically continue, and we're not lawyers, right? We're also not black, so we're perfect for this podcast. But for them to continue to rationalize that it's okay to draw minority majority districts, basically relies on, and the language is that you have to still continue to show that there's like a negative impact based on race and based on the previous policies that are impacting society today. So you kind of need, for her argument to hold up, you need the idea that African Americans still don't have equal access to the ballot box in order to rationalize this policy. And that's why a lot of people, there's been a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. I think that the Supreme Court is set to reverse this 1982 amendment to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which they're going to say, it's going to gut the Voting Rights Act. And you'll hear a lot of claims of racial oppression. And we know people get so overheated on this. Remember, Georgia passed an election reform law in the wake of the 2020 election. And they were massive boycotts. They lost the All-Star game just because they say, look, you can't pass out political information. So the racially charged past, the left very much wants it to be relevant to the present.
Yeah, and but the net effect is that congressional districts are drawn not to try to keep communities together or try to provide, some cohesive representation of that area. They are carved out to benefit certain racial minorities. And by the way, racial minorities, we're primarily talking about the black community, although you said in Texas, there's an effort to carve out majority Hispanic districts that the Republicans are pushing for.
But not because they're Hispanic. And I think to your point, and this is the larger point that we'll get to as it relates to the census, and this is all just about power. It's not about race. They're using civil rights and they're using race as the puppet to hold up to really maintain political power. That's the whole point. Because in Texas, California is responding to Texas. Texas has redrawn their map, and 4 of the 5 new districts that they're drawing in Texas are majority minority Hispanic, and that's because Republicans think that they win the Hispanic vote in
Right.
Texas. And as we pointed out previously, in California, they're redrawing the map to suppress it's not about ethnicity, it's just about politicians. They're getting rid of, like, there's only 9 of the 61 or 9 of the 52 congressional districts in California, and that's going to go down to like 2.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, and we made the point, like, if Republicans were a race, people would be crying racial oppression, but California's like, we don't care.
Yeah. And look, the gerrymandering that takes place, both sides have done it. That's been part of American history for a long time. It's using the rationale that, this is not naked politics of gerrymandering. This is actually about a social good and preventing racial discrimination and reversing racial injustice in the past. That's the part that bothers me, because it's naked politics. It's none of those things. So the second part of this issue relates to representation as to how congressional districts are actually drawn. And there's very interesting research that has come out concerning the 2020 census. Now, if you told me, hey, there's a really interesting study on the 2020 census, I'm sorry, I did terrible at statistics in college. It doesn't interest me. But this is fascinating, because this actually shows, to my mind, how the Census Bureau was manipulated to boost the fortunes of Democrats and hurt Republicans.
Which I don't understand how it's possible, because isn't the census just counting? Like, shouldn't we just, like, counting is just math, right? Like, there shouldn't be a political bent to just how many people do we have,
right?
And therefore we make decisions about how many votes we give the states based on how many people are in the state.
Yeah, no, and look, that's kind of what I thought with the census too. You have the people that come out with their pads, they do their counting.
Yeah, are we not, like, legitimately counting everybody?
No. We're not. And in fact, in 2020, they used something called differential privacy for the first time ever. And it was drawn up by John Aboud, who is the Census Bureau's chief scientist.
Okay.
He has a history of being a Democratic donor, for whatever that's worth.
Well, it sounds like it might be worth quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And essentially what he said is that there are minority groups that are underrepresented in the count. So we have to have a strategy to make sure that they are actually being, quote unquote, counted. And so the way you do that is you create a mathematical algorithm that will make sure that, quote unquote, underrepresented groups are actually fully represented. And here's the problem. The problem is they did this in 2020, and then the Census Bureau later in 2022 came out. By the way, Aboud is now at Cornell University. He's retired. He's no longer there. This U.S. Census Bureau admitted in 2022 that the model actually did the opposite of what it said it was going to do. It was going to more accurately count. It actually overcounted in some states and undercounted in others.
Well, I'm sure it had a politically neutral impact, right? Like, I'm sure this was not a big deal.
Yeah, no. Here's the shocking thing, and I say shocking with a bit of irony.
Because this guy is an academic professor. You said he's at Cornell now, and you mentioned casually, breezily even, that he's a Democrat donor.
In the past, yes, he had been. Democrat-leaning states were widely overcounted, and GOP-leaning states were undercounted. So the undercount states, these are states that the Census Bureau gave a fewer population than they actually did, were Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas. The states that were overcounted included Delaware, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, and Rhode Island. In the case of Florida, the undercount was 750,000 people. In the case of Texas, it was at least 500,000 people. And the states of Minnesota and Rhode Island were overcounted, which allowed them to keep congressional seats that they otherwise would have lost. The net effect, now this is an academic study that was done outside of the Census Bureau, the net effect was that this shifted 9 congressional seats away from Republican states and towards Democrat-leaning states. And in addition to that, Republican states lost $90 billion in federal grants. Democrats got $57 billion more than they should have, because, of course, the census not only determines how many congressional seats you get, it also determines how much you get in block grants from the federal government.
It's like in Superman 3 when they like changed the computer to like round up all the half cents or whatever. That was the whole point of that.
Right.
Like, so like a small error in the computer, it's also kind of a plot point in the movie Office Space, but a small error in the computer leads to like billions of dollars being funneled to places it's not supposed to be.
Yeah.
That like literally happened in real life.
Yeah, that's exactly that's a very good analogy. And here's the other thing. About was asked by the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, to look at asking a basic citizenship question: are you a U.S. citizen? And he said this would be catastrophic. It would distort, who responded. The courts eventually prevented the Trump administration from doing this because the Constitution says the census is supposed to be a counting of people. Not necessarily citizens. Of course, that's open to debate. But the bottom line is that these sorts of statistical debates end up having an enormous political effect. Think about 9 congressional seats, how that would change the balance in Congress. And as you pointed out, it all tends to skew one particular way, which leads you to believe that this was not just sort of an academic error, that there was a purpose or an intent by someone, whether about or other people that he's with, there was an intent by someone to skew the results for a certain political advantage.
Well, even without assigning intent, what I think is really interesting, and the reason why we're talking about that story plus the Ketanji Brown Jackson story at the same time, is they both hinge on the same premise, which you heard Ketanji Brown Jackson say out loud, which is that in some sense, African Americans are less able than regular people. I mean, that's like because the whole point of that is like we have to overweight for them because
they can't respond to a census.
They're not going to
question.
respond to a census. We won't be able to find them. It's like the magical, disappearing minority that we're not going to be able to find. And it's the same thing when it comes to the voting, which is why they say, I mean, we talked about like voter ID laws.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, you have to use a voter ID to do almost anything. But what is the biggest argument against voter ID laws?
Yeah, that for some reason minorities don't have ID. That's essentially the claim, which is incredibly insulting.
The premise is that they're not able to to procure or keep and then produce an ID.
Yeah.
But in fact, we have stats on this 2019 survey. 10 years of turnout data from all 50 states show that voter ID laws have no negative effect on registration or turnout. And in fact, like Hispanic citizens, according to the survey, were more likely to turn out to vote when voter ID was required.
Oh, interesting.
But you always heard that was argument against it. But then, in states like Ohio and Indiana, which had to fight for the right to like require them, you saw voter turnout increase. Now that Obama had something to do with that. But that's what's just really fascinating to me. Like, African Americans are registered to vote at a higher rate than Hispanics or Asians. Like they continue to keep this lower thing.
Right.
But you don't ever hear people say, "Oh, we need to like reach out to Asians."
Right. right. Because Asians get confused and don't have ID and don't answer. I mean, no, it is incredibly insulting to take this posture, and it's the posture of their own community's leadership. A lot of them. I mean, they make these sort of absurd claims. I always, when it comes to these kind of policy debates, want to assume the motivation of the people on the other side is pure. Mm-hmm. All right. So maybe they are trying to, but honestly, when you look at this, you can't really argue that. You can't really argue that their motivation is to try to help people get access because somehow they're disabled, like the Americans for Disabilities Act. It is totally a power play. They don't want us to be able to track who's voting. They don't want us to have representation that's based on actual population trends. They want to have a representative form of government that to a certain extent is fixed before we even get a chance to vote, because they are going to determine that states like California or New York or Rhode Island are going to get more congressional representation than they actually are supposed to, because they've effectively rigged the census and the way the count was done.
It's like we use chat. It's like you say it's like for political purposes. One of my favorite phrases is never mistake incompetence for conspiracy.
Right.
What if we were just lazy and we're like, man, going out and knocking all them dang doors, that's a lot of work. What if we just like, hey, Siri, how many people are in California? You know?
Yeah. No, and I'm sure that's incompetence is part of it as well. But it's a massive problem, and I think we've had a very healthy conversation in America about voter integrity. I don't share some of the wilder theories about ballot manipulation and the voting machines being hacked. But there's a legitimate question about things like mail-in ballots. We should also have, I think, a legitimate debate about how congressional districts are actually apportioned, how they are created, and how they create massive distortions in how we're actually represented in Washington.
I mean, especially in the context of what California is doing. I mean, at least that's like above board. Like
right.
that, they're having a vote on can we do this? Texas
right.
has done it with their legislature. But what you just described is something that no one voted for.
Right.
No one said, let's manipulate this, but it happened behind a computer screen in
right.
its algorithm
yeah.
that this well-meaning liberal, even to be charitable, but based on a sort of prejudiced assumption about a lower class, minorities
right.
and
right.
underrepresentation, has impact. I mean, that's stealing billions of dollars from states, which, by the way, some of those states, this is the sad irony, have the highest percentage of minority population.
Right. Right. And also are more responsible fiscally. I mean, a state like Florida, we both live here, is running a surplus, and yet they got jilted out of billions of dollars in federal money because of the federal count, et cetera. So what's the solution here? I mean, we need to have a census. The Constitution requires a census. We need to have congressional districts drawn. From my perspective, we need to have greater transparency in how the census is done. This sort of black box, we're going to use algorithms, we're going to statistically evaluate and determine what the actual count is. I'm sorry, it's total manipulation. And when it comes to congressional districts, at least the gerrymandering that's going on in Texas, that goes on in California, that goes on in every state, is being done by politicians that were elected, and it's being talked about and discussed openly. The problem is when you wrap it in some kind of good, like we're doing this to change the balance of racial inequality, or we're doing this, with some great altruism. I'm sorry, that to me is ridiculous. Let's just go to the brazen, bare-knuckled politics that's always been there. It's out in the open, and people themselves can determine whether it bothers them or not.
And I do think it's interesting to see what the Supreme Court's going to do when they ultimately, I think, do reverse this 1982 kind of adjustment.
Yeah.
Is it's basically going to be doing the same thing that Donald Trump has done, which is like, look, okay, there's been a bad history.
Yeah.
But that doesn't have to hold us hostage for how we move forward. And let's just be honest. And the facts are minority representation in Congress is at historic highs. It has tripled over the last several decades. It's gone nothing but up since the last 40, 50 years. And I do think it's fair to question, like, do we have to hold on to this thing that was meant to address a wrong if that wrong no longer exists?
Yeah, and let's not take a bad history and make it a bad present, right? I mean, let's
a great
not
phrase.
Let's not create. Thank you. I have my moments. Let's not create injustices now because of an injustice that was done 85 years ago in Arkansas or Mississippi or wherever it was done. That to me is the bottom line. That and transparency, I think, is always key. Well, we are going to watch these stories, things that are happening behind the curtains, because that's where a lot of important decisions are made. You can find out more about the research we do at thedrilldown.com, and please subscribe to this podcast. Thanks again for listening. We know your time is valuable. Until next time, thanks.